In the days when Gilgalad yet held sway in Linden, and the light of the two trees still gleamed in the memory of the firstborn, there came to the ancient city of Osgiliath tiding, dark and fell. The great bridge that spanned the Anduin stood proud beneath the stars, its 7 arches wrought of stone hewn from the very bones of the mountain, and upon its span burned the eternal flame that had never been quenched since the city's founding. Isildur walked upon the eastern battlements in the hour before dawn, his hand resting upon the pommel of his sword. The wind from Ithilien bore strange scents, smoke where no fires should burn, and beneath it something fouler still. His brother Anarion stood beside him, dark-haired and keen of eye, reading the same portent in the grey light. The beacons of Henneth Anun have not been lit these 3 days past, Anarion spoke, his voice low with foreboding. Nor have any riders come from the rangers of the eastern woods. From the western towers came the sound of horn call, not the clear note of Gondor's clarion, but something deeper, more ancient. The brothers exchanged glances of understanding. In the houses of learning, the lore masters had spoken in hushed tones of the old warnings, the prophecies graven upon the stones of seeing before their corruption. When the flame fails and the river runs black, the sleepers beneath the world shall wake. Captain Thorongil of the Tower Guard ascended the stair, his mail bright in the growing light. Behind him came 3 rangers of Ithilien, their green cloaks torn and their faces grim with ill news. The foremost among them knelt before the brothers, and when he raised his head, both princes saw in his eyes a shadow that spoke of things better left unspoken. "My lords," the ranger said, his voice hoarse as one who has ridden far without rest, "the eastern woods burn, not with the clean fire of woodcraft or war, but with flames that give no light, and consume not wood nor stone, but hope itself. We have seen things walking in that darkness that were not shaped by Eru's hand in the beginning of day." The sound of many feet upon stone arose from the courtyard below. The guard was mustering at the summons of horns, but their step was heavy, as though some weight beyond the bearing of arms pressed upon them. From the river came the lapping of dark water against the bridge's foundations, but the rhythm was wrong, too measured, too much like the beating of some vast and terrible heart. Isildur drew his sword, and its blade gleamed with inner fire. Yet even that light seemed dimmed, as though the very air had grown thick with shadow. "Send word to Minas Anor," he commanded. "Let my father know that the ancient enemy stirs, and light the beacon fire upon the dome of stars. Let all who serve the light know that the hour of trial has come upon us." But even as the words left his lips, a great wind arose from the east, and with it came a sound like the crying of lost soul. The eternal flame that had burned upon the great bridge for nigh on 700 years flickered, guttered, and died. In the deep places beneath Osgiliath, where the roots of the mountains touched the foundations of the ancient city, something stirred that had lain dormant since the elder day. The dwarven-wrought halls that honeycombed the living rock had been sealed by the wisdom of Gilgalad after the last alliance, their entries warded with spells of binding and forgetting. Yet now, those seals cracked like ice in spring's first thaw. Master Elrohir walked the ancient passages by the light of crystal lamp, his elven sight piercing the gloom that mere mortal eyes could not fathom. Beside him strode Palando the Blue, one of the Istari, his staff crowned with silver fire. They had come at the summons of dreams that had troubled both the wise of Rivendell and the guardians of the flame, dreams of voices calling from beneath the world. "The air grows thick with malice," Elrohir observed, his hand upon the hilt of his blade. "Something wakes that was not meant to see the light of Anor again." The blue wizard nodded gravely, his gray eyes reflecting depths of knowledge gathered in the uttermost west. In the archives of Numenor, ere its drowning, were written warnings of the sleepers, servants of the shadow from the wars before the moon's first rising. The wise of that realm thought them destroyed utterly, but it seems they were merely bound. They came at last to a great door wrought of Ithilden, its surface inscribed with the script of Eregion, in the days of its glory. But the words of binding were cracked and fading, and through the growing fissures seeped a darkness visible, thick as oil and twice as foul. From beyond the door came sounds that no throat shaped for speech should make, a language older than Quenya, words that had not been spoken since the music was marred. "We must warn the princes," Palando said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "If the bindings fail completely." His words were cut short by a sound like breaking stone. The great door shuddered on its hinges, and from the cracks there poured forth not merely darkness, but despair made manifest. The crystal lamps guttered and failed, and in the sudden blackness they heard the sound of something vast unfolding itself after long ages of constraint. Above them, in the halls of the living, the stones of Osgiliath began to weep. Meanwhile, in the houses of healing, the wise woman Eoreth tended to refugees from the eastern settlement. Their wounds were strained, not cuts or burns such as war might bring, but withering of the flesh, as though life itself had been drawn from them. The children spoke in their sleep of tall figures walking in flame that cast no light, and their words were not in the common speech, but in tongues that predated the sundering of the world. "They came with the dying of the light," whispered an old farmer whose hair had turned white in a single night. Tall they were, and crowned with shadow. Where they walked, the very grass blackened and died. They spoke no word that we could understand, yet we knew their meaning well enough. They had come to reclaim what was theirs of old. In the Tower of the Moon, where the lore masters of Gondor kept their most precious manuscripts, Mithrandir the Grey pored over scrolls that had not been unrolled since the first years of the realm. The parchment was yellow with age and brittle as autumn leaves, but the words upon them blazed with terrible significance as the pattern of present events began to match the warnings of the wise who had gone before. Prince Anarion stood beside the wizard's chair, his face grave in the light of the reading lamps. Before them lay spread the chronicle of Gil-galad's war, penned by the scribes of Lindon in the years when the last alliance was formed. But it was not the familiar tale of the war's ending that held their attention. It was a passage that had been thought to refer to events far in the future, if at all. When the sleepers wake and the flame fail, Mithrandir read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Then shall the ancient servants of the shadow reclaim their dominion over stone and stream. 7 there were who bound themselves to darkness ere the first rising of the sun, and 7 seals were set upon them in the depths. But seals may crack, and binding may break, if the wisdom of the wise proves insufficient to the malice of the foe." Anarion frowned, his warrior's mind grappling with implications that chilled the blood. 7 seals, 7 servants. How many of the seals remain intact? Before the wizard could answer, young Boromir burst through the chamber doors, his usually bright face pale with urgency. "My lords, you must come at once. The watchfires upon the Pelennor burn with flames that give no warmth, and the horses will not cross the Anduin. Something moves in the deep waters, something vast and terrible." They followed the young captain to the high windows that looked eastward over the river. What they saw there drained the courage from their hearts. The Anduin ran red as blood in the dying light, and shapes moved beneath its surface. Not fish or any creature of the natural world, but things that had been wrought in the forges of malice, for purposes that honest minds could not encompass. "The river itself has been turned to their service," Mithrandir observed grimly. "The ancient powers wake, and with them all the servants they bound to their will in the elder days." From the east came the sound of horn, not the clear call of mortal trumpets, but a deep, resonant note that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. As that sound rolled across the water, the red flames upon the watchfires turned black, and shadows began to gather in places where no shadows should fall. In the harbor, the swan ships of the Guardians of the Flame bobbed uneasily at their moorings, and their captains reported that compass needles spun wildly, unable to find true north, while that baleful music sounded across the water. In the council chamber of the citadel, the wise gathered as shadows lengthened toward night. Prince Isildur sat at the head of the great table, while around him were assembled the mightiest defenders of the realm: Mithrandir the Grey, Elrohir of Rivendell, Pallando the Blue, Captain Thorongil of the Tower Guard, and Master Vilthang, Lore Keeper of the Scroll. The light of many candles could not dispel the darkness that seemed to press against the very walls. "Tell us of the seven," Isildur commanded, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "If we are to face them, we must understand what manner of foe stands against us." Master Vilthang unrolled an ancient chart, its surface marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. They were wrought by the shadow, in the days before days, when the world was young and malleable to the will of powers both great and terrible. Not Maiar were they, nor of the kindreds of the children, but something between, spirits of malice given form and purpose by arts that are now mercifully lost. Pallando took up the tale, his voice laden with the wisdom of the uttermost west. 7 citadels they raised in the dark years, each one a focus of power and malice. From these strongholds they ruled over the creatures of shadow, orcs unnumbered, fell beasts, and worse things still. But when Gil-galad and Elendil made their alliance, the 7 were cast down and bound, their citadels broken, their power scattered, yet not destroyed, Elrohir added quietly. For things of such concentrated malice cannot be unmade by any power less than that which first gave them being. Instead, they were bound with seals of adamant and spellcraft, their bodies imprisoned and their spirits chained. The blue wizard gestured to the symbols upon the chart. 7 binding places were chosen, 1 in the roots of Mount Doom, 1 in the depths beneath Dol Guldur, 1 in the caverns that lie under Isengard, the others. He paused, his face growing more grave still. The others were bound in places thought beyond the reach of malice. 1 lies beneath Minas Tirith itself. 1 sleeps under the foundations of Edoras. 1 was sealed in the roots of Caradhras. And the 7th? Isildur asked, though he feared the answer. The 7th was bound here, in the deep places beneath Osgiliath, where the roots of the mountains touch the living stone. Of all the seals, it was thought the strongest, for it was wrought by the hands of Gil-galad himself, and blessed by the light of Erendil's star. Thunder rolled across the city, though no clouds marred the evening sky. In that sound, all present heard the echo of vast doors opening after long ages of closure, and they knew that the strongest seal of all had finally broken. The great beacon of Osgiliath had burned for 7 centuries without fail, its light visible from Dol Amroth to the teeth of Mordor. Wrought by the Númenórean masters in the early days of the realm, it was no common fire, but flame kindled from the very essence of light itself, fed not by wood or oil, but by the hope and courage of those who dwelt in its radiance. Now, Captain Thorongil stood upon the beacon tower and watched in growing horror as the eternal flame dwindled to a mere flicker. The fire that had blazed tall as a tree now cowered like a candle in a wind, and its light, once bright enough to read by at a league's distance, barely illuminated the platform on which it burned. "How long has it been failing?" asked Prince Anarion, who had climbed the long stair to witness this calamity with his own eyes. "Since the dawn," Thorongil replied grimly. "At first, we thought it but a trick of the morning light, but as the day has worn on..." He gestured helplessly at the dying flame. "The keeper of the beacon says the fire consumes its fuel as always, yet gives forth ever less light. It is as though something draws the very essence from it." From the streets below came the sound of many feet, not marching in order, but the shuffle and stumble of folk in flight. The people of the outer districts were fleeing toward the center of the city, bearing tales that froze the blood. In the eastern quarters, they said, shadows moved that were not cast by any object under sun or moon. Wells that had run clear for generations now bubbled forth water black as pitch, and those who drank from them fell into a sleep from which none could wake them. "My lord," called a voice from the stair. Young Damrod of the Rangers climbed toward them, his green cloak singed and his face blackened with smoke. "The eastern bridge is under attack, but not by any foe we can bring to battle. They come like mist, like shadow, taking shape only when they strike. The prince and the captain followed the ranger to the eastern battlement, where they looked out over a sight that would haunt their dreams until their dying day. The great stone bridge that spanned the Anduin was wreathed in flames that gave no light, black fire that consumed nothing yet burned forever. Through that wall of shadow came figures tall and terrible, crowned with malice and bearing weapons forged in the darkness before the sun's first rising. Sound the retreat, Anarion commanded, his voice steady despite the horror before them. Pull our forces back to the inner city. We cannot hold against such as these with sword and spear alone. But even as the horns began their mournful call, the eternal flame of Osgiliath guttered and died, plunging the ancient city into a darkness that was more than the mere absence of light. In that blackness, the laughter of the seven rang out like the tolling of funeral bells. In the hall of fire beneath the citadel, the defenders of Osgiliath gathered in council, while above them the ancient city burned with flames that cast no light. The hall had been wrought in the earliest days of Gondor's glory, its walls carved with scenes of victory, and its ceiling painted with stars that mimicked the true heavens. Now those painted stars seemed dim and lifeless, and the carved victories appeared to mock their present extremity. Prince Isildur sat at the head of the great table, his face drawn with the weight of command. Around him were gathered all who might offer counsel in this dark hour. Mithrandir the Grey, whose wisdom spanned the aged. Elrohir of Rivendell, bearing the authority of Gil-galad's heir. Palando the Blue, learned in the lore of ancient days. And the captains of the guard, grim-faced men whose swords had tasted orc blood in a dozen battles. The eastern districts have fallen, reported Captain Thorongil, his voice heavy with defeat. The bridge burns with their cursed fire, and our weapons cannot harm them. They move like smoke, like shadow, striking where they will, and vanishing when we would answer blow for blow. What of the people? Anarion asked, though he feared the answer. Those who could flee have sought refuge in the western city. The others. Thorongil's voice failed him. The others sleep, my lord, but it is not the sleep of peace. They breathe, their hearts beat, yet no word or wound can wake them. And as they sleep, the color drains from them, as though life itself seeps away into shadow. Mithrandir leaned forward, his gray eyes reflecting depths of sorrow and wisdom. It is the oldest power of the seven, to drain the essence of life itself, leaving behind empty shells that know neither joy nor grief, neither hope nor fear. In the elder days, they turned whole armies of men and elves into their thralls by this means. Then we must evacuate the city entire, Isildur declared. Withdraw across the Anduin to Minas Anor, where the Tower of the Sun may give us some protection from their malice. But Elrohir shook his head gravely. The corruption spreads, Prince of Gondor. Already the western bridges show signs of their taint. The stone grows cold, the mortar crumbles. If we flee now, we but carry the shadow with us. Better to make our stand here, where the seals were strongest, than to spread the contagion throughout the realm. A silence fell upon the council, heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Outside, the sounds of battle had ceased, not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because there was no longer any force left to oppose them. The ancient city of Osgiliath, jewel of Gondor's realm, was falling to powers that had slept since the elder days. Then young Boromir, who had sat silent throughout the debate, rose from his place at the table's foot. His face was pale but determined, bearing the look of one who has glimpsed a desperate hope. There is another way, he said quietly, but it would require a sacrifice that none should be asked to make. In the deep archives beneath the Hall of Fire, Boromir led the council to a vault that had remained sealed since the founding of Osgiliath. The door was wrought of mithril and inscribed with words in the Elvish tongue, and it opened only to the touch of one who bore the blood of Isildur in his veins. Beyond lay a chamber small and round, its walls lined with crystals that had captured starlight in the elder days. At the chamber's heart stood a pedestal of white marble, and upon it rested a sword whose blade seemed wrought of captured flame. Even sheathed, it cast light enough to illuminate the chamber, and all who looked upon it felt their hearts lift despite the shadow that pressed around them. "Aaron Ruth," Mithrandir breathed, recognizing the blade from lore older than kingdom. "The king's ire, forged for Thingol of Doriath, in the days when the Silmarils yet shone in Middle-earth. How comes it to be here, in the vaults of Gondor?" "It was Gil-galad's gift to my forefather Elendil," Isildur replied, his hand hovering over the sword's hilt. "But the High King laid upon it a geas. It could be drawn only in the realm's uttermost need, and only by one willing to pay the price of its use." "What price?" Anarion asked, though something in his brother's expression told him the answer would break their hearts. Boromir pointed to the crystals that lined the chamber wall. In their depths, scenes played out like memories made visible, images of the blade's forging in Menegroth, its use in the wars of the Elder Days, and the great working that had bound its power with a thread of adamant and sorrow. "The sword contains the light of Arundil's star," Boromir explained, his young face grave beyond his years. "It can cut through any darkness, break any binding, destroy even the immortal servants of shadow. But to do so, it must be fed with the life force of its wielder. One stroke might drain a year of life, a great battle." He spread his hands helplessly. There would be no returning from such a victory. The council sat in silence, contemplating the weight of such a choice. Above them, the sounds of the dying city filtered down, screams that were cut short, the crash of falling masonry, and beneath it all, the terrible laughter of the Seven, as they savored their long-delayed triumph. "I will bear it," Isildur said at last, reaching for the blade's hilt. But Anarion's hand caught his wrist. "Brother, no. You are the heir, the realm's hope for the future. If any must make this sacrifice, the choice is mine, alone." Isildur replied firmly, "The sword was given into our line's keeping, and the burden of its use falls upon me." Yet even as he spoke, Aranruth began to glow more brightly, and in its light they saw words appearing on the blade itself, script that shifted and changed even as they watched, writing itself in fire upon the steel. And the words it bore were not in any earthly tongue, but in the speech of the Valar themselves, terrible and final. "Only in willing sacrifice shall the light be released. Only through love's surrender shall the darkness be bound. But know this, the price paid shall be returned threefold when the hour of greatest need is come." As dawn broke over the besieged city, though its light seemed pale and sickly through the pall of shadow, Prince Isildur stood upon the highest tower of Osgiliath, with Aranruth naked in his hands. The blade sang as it cut the air, its edge blazing with the light of Arundil's star, and where that light fell, the shadows recoiled like living things in pain. Below him, the streets of the eastern city crawled with the servants of the Seven, not merely the tall figures wreathed in darkness that had broken the seals, but creatures of earlier making. Orcs twisted beyond recognition, fell beasts with eyes like burning coals, and things that had no earthly name. All moved with terrible purpose toward the western bridges, where the last defenders of Gondor prepared to make their final stand. "Now!" Isildur whispered, and leaped from the tower's height. The blade's light blazed like a falling star as he plummeted toward the enemy host. Where Aranruth's radiance touched them, the creatures of shadow simply ceased to be, not slain, but unmade, their essence scattered to the winds like smoke. The prince landed among them like a thunderbolt, and every stroke of the star blade carved a path of destruction through their rank, the cost terrible. With each swing of Aranruth, months of life drained from Isildur's frame. His dark hair began to show threads of silver, lines appeared at the corners of his eyes, and his step, though still swift, carried the weight of advancing years. The Seven themselves came forth to meet him, towering figures wreathed in flame and shadow, bearing weapons forged in the darkness before the moon's first rising. They were ancient beyond measure, their malice concentrated by millennia of binding, and their power was such that the very stones cracked beneath their feet. The first of the seven wielded a blade of black ice that could freeze the blood in mortal veins. But Aranruth's flame melted his weapon like wax, and the star fire consumed him utterly. Yet the victory cost Isildur 5 years of life, and his hair was now more silver than black. The second bore a whip of shadow that could bind the spirit itself, but the light of Arundil's star broke those bonds like cobwebs, and another of the ancient enemy was unmade. 10 years flowed from Isildur's life like water from a broken vessel, and deep lines now marked his face. One by one, the seven fell before Aranruth's blazing edge, but with each victory, more of Isildur's life force was consumed by the blade's hungry light. By the time the sixth of the ancient enemies had been destroyed, the prince who had begun the battle as a man in his prime now appeared aged beyond his years, his back bent and his breath coming in labored gasps. The seventh and mightiest of the seven remained, their lord and master, whose name had been struck from all record, lest its speaking summon him forth. He stood twice the height of mortal men, crowned with a circlet of black flame, and in his hands he bore a sword that drank light itself. The final confrontation took place upon the great bridge of Osgiliath, where the Seven's lord waited like a dark pillar against the dawn. Around him, the very air seemed to writhe with malice, and the ancient stones cracked beneath the weight of his presence. His voice, when he spoke, was like the grinding of mountain against mountain, words that predated speech itself. "Heir of Isildur," the Shadow Lord intoned, "do you not see the futility of your struggle? I am older than your kingdoms, mightier than your king. I have drunk deeply of the darkness between the stars, and made it my own. What hope has mortal flesh against such power?" Isildur, now bent with the weight of years that had not been his to bear, raised Aranruth with trembling hands. The blade's light seemed dimmed, as though even the fire of Arundil's star struggled against such concentrated malice. "I have hope enough," he replied, his aged voice still carrying the authority of kingship, "for I do not fight alone." At his words, figures emerged from the shadows of the bridge, not reinforcements of mortal men, for such would have been consumed instantly by the Shadow Lord's presence, but the spirits of those who had given their lives in the binding of the seven. Gil-galad himself strode forth, his spear Eglos blazing with silver flame, and beside him came Elendil the Tall, mighty Narsil in his hand. "You think the dead will aid you?" The Shadow Lord laughed, and his mirth was like the sound of breaking glass. "I am the master of all who have passed beyond the circles of the world. They must obey my will." But the spirits did not bow to his command. Instead, they formed a circle around the ancient enemy, their combined light pressing back the darkness that surrounded him. And in their midst stood another figure, one whose presence shocked even the Shadow Lord to silence. It was Celebrimbor, the smith of Ost-in-Edhil, who had wrought the rings of power in the elder days. His form blazed with silver fire, and in his hands he bore not weapons, but tools of making, hammer and tongs that could shape even the essent spirits themselves. "You know me, Ancient One," Celebrimbor said, his voice carrying the music of the spheres. "You know what I have the power to do." Sit. The Shadow Lord's form wavered, and for the first time in ages uncounted, fear entered his voice. "You cannot unmake me entirely. I am bound to the music itself. To destroy me would be to wound the very foundations of the world." "Not destroy," the elven smith replied, raising his hammer, "but reshape. Make of you what you were meant to be before the discord entered your song." The battle that followed was not one of sword against sword, but of essence against essence, the malice of ages set against the power of creation itself. Isildur stood at the circle's heart, Aranruth blazing in his hands, pouring the last of his life into the blade's star fire. Around him, the spirits of the mighty dead held the Shadow Lord fast, while Celebrimbor worked his final smithcraft. But even as victory seemed within their grasp, the unthinkable happened. As Celebrimbor raised his hammer for the stroke that would reshape the Shadow Lord's essence, the ancient enemy's form suddenly solidified, becoming more real, terrible than ever before. His laughter shook the very foundations of the bridge, and in his eyes blazed a malice so concentrated that even the spirits of the dead recoiled. "Did you think I had revealed all my power?" the Shadow Lord roared. "I, who was present at the music's first discord, I have been playing a deeper game than any of you suspected." With a gesture of his sword, he shattered the circle of spirits, sending even Gil-galad and Elendil reeling back into the shadows from whence they had come. Celebrimbor's hammer rang against his blade like a bell, but could not break through his guard, and Isildur, drained almost to the point of death by Aranruth's hunger, could barely stand against the waves of malice that rolled from their enemy. "You wish to know the truth?" the Shadow Lord continued, his form growing ever more terrible to behold. "I am not merely one of the seven. I am their creator, their master, their very essence given form. The others were but shadows of shadows, reflections of my will. Destroy me, and you destroy the very concept of darkness itself. The world would burn in unending light, and all the beauty of shadow and mystery would be lost forever." Isildur felt the terrible truth of those words. In his hands, Aranruth's blade began to dim as doubt entered his heart. If what the Shadow Lord spoke was truth, then their victory would be Pyrrhic indeed, a world of harsh, unrelenting light, where no gentle shadow could offer rest, no comforting darkness could hide sorrow. But then, from the depths of memory, came another voice, not the Shadow Lord's words of despair, but the wisdom of Gil-galad spoken long ago. "Light and darkness are both part of the music, young prince. But when darkness seeks to devour light entirely, then it has forgotten its proper place in the song." With renewed strength born of understanding, Isildur raised Aranruth once more. "You lie," he said simply. "You are not darkness itself, but darkness corrupted, shadow that has forgotten its purpose and seeks only to consume. True darkness knows its place and time. You have forgotten yours." The blade blazed forth with light renewed, but this time its fire was different. Not the harsh blaze of a star, but the gentle radiance of moonlight on water, strong enough to banish corruption, but soft enough to leave healthy shadow untouched. The Shadow Lord screamed as that purified light touched him, and his form began to change. The malice drained away like poison from a wound, and beneath it they glimpsed what he had been in the beginning, not a creature of evil, but a servant of the music, whose song had been twisted by discord into something unrecognizable. "Now, Celebrimbor!" Isildur cried, pouring the last of his strength into the blade. The elven smith's hammer fell, and with it the work of remaking began. What followed could not be described in any tongue of Middle-earth, for it was a working that touched the very roots of creation itself. Celebrimbor's hammer rang against the anvil of reality, reshaping not merely the Shadow Lord's form, but his very essence. Each blow stripped away another layer of corruption, revealing the original design that had been buried beneath millennia of malice. The process was agony for all involved. Isildur, pouring his life force into Aranruth to maintain the purifying light, felt his very essence being drawn into the working. His hair turned white as snow, his face became lined with the wisdom of ages, and his hands trembled with the weakness of extreme old age. Yet still he held fast, knowing that to falter now would doom not only themselves, but all who dwelt in the light. Celebrimbor himself was not unchanged by the working. With each strike of his hammer, portions of his own spirit were woven into the remaking, binding his essence to that of the creature he sought to heal. His silver light grew dimmer as he gave more and more of himself to the task, and the Shadow Lord, or rather, the being he was becoming, writhed in transformative anguish as his fundamental nature was altered. The crown of black flame cracked and fell away, revealing a brow marked with starlight. The sword that drank light shattered, its fragments becoming points of gentle luminescence that scattered like fireflies into the dawn. Slowly, impossibly, the creature of shadow began to remember who he had been before the discord claimed him. Memories surfaced like flowers after rain. The joy of creation, the beauty of the music in its harmony, the purpose for which he had first been made. He remembered his true name, though it had been forgotten by all, save the one who had first spoken it. I was. He began, his voice no longer the grinding of stone, but something approaching music. You were Umberto, Celebrimbor said gently, his hammer finally still. The shadowed one, keeper of restful darkness and guardian of gentle night. You were made to balance the harsh light of day with the mercy of shadow. As the transformation neared completion, a wonder occurred that none had expected. The life force that Isildur had poured into Aranruth began to flow back to him, but changed, purified and strengthened by its passage through the starfire. His white hair darkened to silver, his lined face grew smooth, and his bent back straightened. But more than mere youth returned to him. He had gained the wisdom of age and the strength that comes from sacrifice freely given. The bridge of Osgiliath, which had been cracking under the weight of battle, began to repair itself. Where the Shadow Lord's feet had touched, flowers of silver and gold now bloomed. The cursed flames that had burned without light were transformed into gentle beacons that welcomed rather than threatened. But even as this wonder unfolded, Umberto, for such was his true name, raised a hand of warning. His form, though purified, still bore the weight of ages and the knowledge of things that would yet come to pass. The remaking is not complete, he said, his voice now like wind through leaves. I have been cleansed of malice, but I remain bound to this realm by the very working that has healed me. And there are others, servants I created in my madness, who yet wander the dark places of the world. They will sense what has occurred here, and they will come. As if summoned by his words, a horn sounded from the eastern hills, not the clear call of Gondor's trumpets, but a deep, mournful note that spoke of ancient hatred and unquenchable thirst for revenge. The Nazgul, greatest of the Shadow Lord's creations in the years of his madness, had felt their master's transformation and were riding to reclaim what they saw as their birthright. 9 there are, Umberto continued, sorrow heavy in his voice, wraiths of kings who sought power above all else and found only slavery. In my corruption, I gave them rings of binding, making them deathless, but not truly alive. They will not accept my redemption. In their eyes, I have become a traitor to the darkness they serve. Isildur, renewed by the Starfire's return, grasped Aranruth with steady hand. The blade had changed too, no longer the harsh brightness of a star, but the steady glow of hope itself. Then we shall face them as we faced you, with courage, wisdom, and the strength that comes from unity. But Celebrimbor shook his head, his form now so diminished by the great working that he seemed like a shadow of his former self. The Nazgul cannot be redeemed as their master was. Too long have they dwelt in the twilight between life and death. Too completely have they surrendered their will to the darkness. They must be destroyed utterly, but the cost. His words were cut short by the sound of hoofbeats on stone. Across the repaired bridge came a sight to freeze the blood. 9 riders cloaked in shadow, their steeds breathing vapor that poisoned the very air. At their head rode the Witch King of Angmar, his crown wreathed in cold fire, his blade singing with the hunger of the grave. Umberto the betrayer, his voice rang out like the tolling of funeral bells. You have broken faith with the darkness that made you mighty. For this treachery you shall know such torment as makes the void seem merciful. The final battle began not with the clash of steel, but with a war of wills that shook the very foundations of reality. The Nazgul came on like a tide of despair, their presence sapping hope from the hearts of mortals and immortals alike. Where their steeds' hooves touched the newly healed bridge, the flowers of silver and gold withered and died, and the stone itself began to weep tears of shadow. Isildur stood firm against their advance, Aranruth blazing in his hands like a beacon of defiance. But he was mortal still, despite the Starfire's gift, and the weight of the Nazgul's despair pressed upon him like a physical force. Beside him, Celebrimbor raised his hammer one final time, though it cost him great effort to do so. But it was Umberto who surprised them all. Instead of fleeing or cowering before his former servants, the redeemed Shadow Lord stepped forward to meet the Witch King's charge. In his hands, shadows gathered, but these were not the corrupted darkness of old, but the gentle shadows of evening, the restful darkness that brings peace to weary eyes. "Hold, servants of despair," he commanded, and his voice carried such authority that even the Nazgul paused in their advance. "You were wrought by my hand in the days of my madness, bound to serve a darkness that knew not its proper place. But I offer you now what I have found: redemption, healing, and return to the music's true harmony." The Witch King's laughter was like breaking glass. Redemption? For us, who have dwelt so long in the spaces between life and death that we remember neither. We are beyond such mortal conceits. We serve the darkness that devours all, not the gentle shadows you now embrace. The battle resumed with redoubled fury. The Nazgul fought not merely with sword and spell, but with the very essence of despair itself. Their weapons could not only slay the body, but drain the spirit, leaving behind empty husks that neither lived nor died, but existed in torment eternal. Yet against them stood an alliance such as had not been seen since the elder days. Isildur wielded Aranruth with all the skill of his lineage and the wisdom gained through sacrifice. Celebrimbor, though diminished, struck with the power of one who had helped shape the very foundations of the world. And Umberto fought with shadows made whole, darkness that healed rather than harmed. One by one, the Nazgul fell, not destroyed, but transformed. For as they were struck by Umberto's purified shadows, the binding rings that held them in undeath cracked and shattered. Released from their eternal torment, the spirits of the 9 kings passed at last into the halls of their fathers, free to find whatever rest awaited them beyond the circles of the world. The Witch King alone remained, his power magnified by his fury at seeing his realm of despair crumble around him. His blade met Aranruth in a clash that sent shockwaves across the Anduin, and for a moment it seemed that even the purified starfire might not be enough to overcome such concentrated malice. But then Celebrimbor spoke a word in the tongue of creation itself, not to reshape or remake, but simply to reveal truth. The Witch King's form wavered, and beneath the shadow and crown, they glimpsed what he had been before pride and hunger for power had claimed him. A king of men who had loved his people and sought only to protect them from the darkness. "Remember," Celebrimbor whispered, pouring the last of his essence into that single word. And the Witch King did remember. He remembered his mortal name, his mortal loves, and the choices that had led him down the path to ruin. With that remembrance came not redemption, for he had gone too far into darkness for that, but understanding. And with understanding came, at last, peace. His crown fell from his brow and shattered on the bridge's stone. His blade crumbled to rust and dust. And the Witch King of Angmar, greatest of the Nazgul, smiled once before he faded into the light of the dawn. The bridge of Osgiliath stood whole and bright in the morning sun. Where the battle had raged, gardens now grew, not the silver and gold flowers of the working, but simple blooms such as might grace any mortal garden. The eternal flame upon the beacon tower blazed once more, but its light was softer now, warmer, welcoming to all who sought its protection. Celebrimbor was gone, his essence finally expended in the great working of redemption. But his gift remained in the repaired city, in the purified shadows that offered rest to weary travelers, and in the knowledge that even the deepest corruption could be healed if love and sacrifice were great enough. Isildur stood upon the bridge as the sun reached its zenith, Aranruth sheathed at his side. The blade would rest now, its great work completed, but it would remain as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories came not through conquest, but through the courage to offer redemption, even to one's enemy. Umberto, the Shadow Lord, no more but simply the keeper of gentle night, bowed deeply to the Prince of Gondor. "I must go now," he said, There are other dark places in the world that have need of healing shadows, but know this: Osgiliath shall never again fall to the forces of despair, for it is protected now by darkness that remembers its purpose. He walked eastward over the bridge, and where his feet touched the stones, night-blooming flowers sprang up to line his path. Soon he was lost to sight, but his presence could still be felt in the restful shadows that gathered in doorways and under eaves, offering comfort to all who sought them. Thus ended the War of the Seven Seal, not with the destruction of evil, but with its transformation into good. The chronicles would remember Isildur's courage and Celebrimbor's sacrifice, but they would remember too that mercy could triumph where mere might could not, and that even the darkest hearts could find their way back to the light. The eternal flame of Osgiliath burned on, a beacon of hope for all who dwelt in Middle-earth, and the city by the river became once again what it had always been meant to be, a bridge between the lands of men and elves, a place where different kindreds could meet in friendship and find strength in their unity. And in the years that followed, when darkness threatened the realm, the people would look to Osgiliath and remember that no shadow was so deep that light could not touch it, and no heart so lost that love could not find it.